been developed with a whole group of experts.
Thank you, Katharina, and good morning, everyone. So briefly, the outline of my talk, I'll give you a quick update on the process and status of the TPP, and then spend most of the time for the talk on the performance targets, since that's a key part of the TPP, and a quick update on the next steps. So I think I don't have to say much about that since Alberto has already outlined the process. Just to, I guess, point out to you that the draft TPP is on the FIND website for you to review in more detail. So I encourage you to have a look at that, and also to look at the meeting report summary, the executive summary that Alberto has shown to you to get more detail to what I'm about to tell you. So on the performance targets, the reason why I'm focusing here on this is because during the survey that we've done, and I'm sure many of you have participated, and I thank you for your input, it's become apparent that that's probably one area where we should spend a bit more time explaining the thinking that goes into that, and I'll use the opportunity today to do that. So I'm coming back to that picture that Hanif Ismail had published, and just to set the definitions clear and what the test concept is essentially that we're talking about here. Again, on the very left hand, essentially, we have TB infection, asymptomatic people, no sign of active tuberculosis. And on the very other extreme, we have active TB disease, microbiological confirmation. And what we would like to have is a test that better predicts which subset of those at the very left will indeed progress to active disease. And as Frank has already alluded to, the consensus has been moving in a direction where our best bet at doing that may well be by trying to detect what is in the middle, incipient TB disease, so still asymptomatic patients, but with evidence of microbiologically confirmed TB, or patients who will, within a quote-unquote short period of time, progress to active TB. And of note, and again, Frank has already alluded to that, a subset of these patients may well not progress to active TB, and that's kind of an important point that I'll get back to in a moment. So again, Frank has set the scene nicely for this, and I don't have to go into great detail on the slide, I think, but progressing my slides. But just to point out to you that it's clear that any test that's trying to predict a future event will not be able to achieve the same performance as a test that tries to tell us what is there right now, a diagnostic test. And there are reasons why there are inherent limits on sensitivity and specificity for any kind of predictive test. And that really relates again to what I agree is a nice model for us to think about that. If we test somebody today, and there may be, for example, there may be early signs of disease happening, it may be that that the precipitating factors, the predisposing factors are addressed. So somebody may be, for example, malnourished today and on his way to active TB, but if this improves, then he may not actually develop TB, and that puts a limit on his specificity. And similarly, somebody may not actually have incipient TB today, but may get reinfected over the course of the next year or so, which is probably the kind of time horizon we are looking at in terms of the performance targets, and that puts limits on the sensitivity. So keeping that in mind, just coming to the basic premises for setting the performance targets here, and that again gets back to what has been said before, the key reasons why the uptake and adherence to preventive therapy now is limited is related, of course, to limits that are on the treatment side, with imperfect efficacy and duration, obviously, and also on the test side with our ability to predict progression being not very good, and low predictive values, and high numbers needed to test and treat. So the concept of positive predictive value and number needed to test and treat, I think, is the best way to conceptualize how we may want to, what kind of targets we may want to set, how good how much we would like to improve upon what is currently available with IGRA and TST. So that's kind of the target that we're targeting, predictive value and number needed to test and treat. But nevertheless, it's important to specify the performance targets in terms of sensitivity and specificity, since, as Frank has shown, the predictive values and number needed to test and treat are very, very dependent on the cumulative incidence, the actual risk of progression, which will vary from setting to setting and population group to population group. And so the way we approach this is essentially in 2 steps. The first step being identifying what are the groups where currently it's recommended to test for latent TB infection, and then looking at the performance of the tests that are currently available. And this is what the performance that I'm showing you here is from an updated systematic review and meta-analysis done by Sandra Kick. This is not yet final and not yet published, but essentially for the IGRA, if we are not, so these are not the typical kind of accuracy measures you will see where we're looking at sensitivity in active TB patients and specificity in healthy controls. This is with follow-up over a year or 2, looking at of those patients that are tested who really does progress to active TB, and their sensitivity for the IGRA has been estimated to be around 80% and specificity around 56%, so quite low specificity, leading to this pretty low positive predictive value. And what we propose then is, in terms of the performance targets, to aim for at least doubling that positive predictive value for the minimum performance targets, and increasing it by a factor of 5 for the optimal performance targets, which then translates into a halving or reducing by a factor of 5 of the number needed to test and treat. And to then bring it back to sensitivity and specificity, we're showing this on contour plots, and I'll just walk you through this over the coming slides, and you also have it in the executive summary. So on this plot, you have on the x-axis the sensitivity of a potential test, and on the y-axis the specificity of a potential test. And what you can see on the z-axis, so to say, or in the area with the shades of gray, are the all possible values of the positive predictive value that you would get for a given combination of sensitivity and specificity. And this is assuming a risk of progression of 2%. And the first thing I want to point out to you here is that in this situation where you have a rare outcome, even with 99% sensitivity and specificity, your positive predictive value will only be 67%. So this is simple math, but I think quite perhaps surprising to many that this may still not seem like a very high value, but this is just the reality if you have a rare disease, and I think it's important for us to calibrate our expectations against that. Next, to show you where the IGRA lies based on the best currently available evidence. So sensitivity, as I said, around 80, specificity 55 or so, and you land then on this contour between 3 and 4% positive predictive value. And accordingly then to what I was saying, around doubling that positive predictive value would lead us on this contour essentially 2 steps higher. And this is an example value where, for example, with sensitivity and specificity of 75% and 75% respectively, this is where you might land. And similarly, for the optimum TPP, you would be in the corner up there. But importantly, we're not necessarily targeting a particular value of sensitivity and specificity. As I was saying, we're targeting a particular predictive value. And so we are saying anywhere on this contour would be meeting the targets that we had set out for minimum and optimum, respectively. And so you may well have a test that is not as sensitive, only around 50% sensitive, but more specific, and may meet that target, or you may have a test that is more sensitive and less specific and may still meet that target. And that's important because depending on the biological underpinning of your test, you may be more able to meet one or the other of these extremes. And here also just to place that on the map, the Correlate of Risk paper by Dan Zak and Tom Scriber and others from the South African group that Frank had mentioned actually meets that TPP based on what they had shown in their publication. And so just to reiterate, I think, some of that and say some observations of what we can learn from that. I think first we need to acknowledge that reaching a very high TPP is really not possible for a test aiming to predict a rare event in typical situations. Secondly, that the proposed minimum target represents an important improvement over what we currently have, and hopefully is something that we think is achievable within kind of a typical 5-year time horizon set for a TPP, and the results from the correlate of risk, I think, show some evidence that this is possible. And thirdly, that the targeted positive predictive value can be achieved with various combinations of sensitivity and specificity. And again, the preferences, both in terms of test development, but also of implementers, of where you would like that trade-off to be, will vary between countries, between different stakeholders. And lastly, I just want to stress that both sensitivity and specificity for such a test can very likely be improved by retesting individuals. So that's kind of one of the important implementation considerations going forward as well. In terms of next steps, so the full report of the meeting in Milan will be published. You already have the executive summary now, and there will be a stakeholder meeting again, hopefully early next year at the WHO, to finalize the TPP, which will then be published, and you can see kind of quite advanced draft on the FIND website already today. So thank you for your attention.